all experienced the crush of modern life. Anxiety is at an all-time high. We're caught between the merciless waters of a culture that pushes us to be and do more. How do we manage that? As Alan Noble, who's been a guest on the show, has written, sometimes we just need to get out of bed. Indeed, our culture pushes us to be more than human, almost. But as theologian Kelly Kapic has shown us, we need to know our limits because we're only human after all. We are God's image bearers. We've been created to reflect his image, and as such, he has created us to work. But how can we work in this modern world when it demands that we be more than human? How can we simply be in a culture that only wants us to do? After all, as today's guest has written, we are human beings, not human doings. So where can we turn to find a voice to guide us in the chaotic cultural waters in which we find ourselves? Well, that's why I've invited today's guest to be on the show. Stephen Lawson is here to help us. Stephen is a whole person productivity coach and founder of the Monk Manual. After spending a decade pushing himself to every limit in his work alongside his colleagues and friends, he slowed down, looked around, and realized something was wrong. Modern productivity has given all the right answers to the wrong questions and was robbing him of the two things he was actually seeking: peace and fulfillment. Determined to find a way of life that accounts for the whole person, body, mind, and spirit, Stephen began a soulful journey that led him to launch Monk Manual. Since its founding, Monk Manual has grown by the average of 200% year over year, with tools and education that have now impacted the lives of over 100,000 people. Stephen also serves as a strategic consultant to a number of for-profit and nonprofit companies. He lives in Buffalo, New York, with his wife, Lauren, and their 3 children. Stephen, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Travis, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
All right, here we go. Fast 5. Are you ready?
I'm ready. I think
Easy one, even though you're up in Buffalo, New York. But let me ask you this. Since you moved there recently, that's not your hometown though, right?
You know what? I actually was born here, but I lived out of Buffalo for a while, recently moved back.
Okay, so here we go. Buffalo, New York. So if you think of that, you think of snow. It just is that. So snow or beach right now?
It's actually sunny out, and there's something about being in Buffalo when the weather gets nice that just feels really glorious. So I'm gonna take, was the question snow or beach?
Just snow or beach?
Oh, beach. I would go with beach.
Even after you went through all the description of beach.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Second question. What's the best advice you've ever been given?
I mean, what's coming to mind is trust yourself.
Trust yourself. Okay. All right. How about what's the best advice you've ever given? How about that one? That's not a question, but just ask that one.
What's the best advice I've ever given?
Don't trust yourself.
I was gonna say love yourself, but I don't know if I've ever said in those exact terms. But we could get into that. But I think that's an important piece.
Okay. All right. Well, here's the next question. If you weren't in Buffalo, New York, where would you be and why?
Probably Paris, France, because I really like Paris, France.
What do you like about Paris?
I don't know. There's something about maybe the aesthetic of it. There's a feeling there that seems to attend to maybe beauty and in a certain there's something that seems to be. I mean, there's a lot that actually I think priorities might not be correct, but there's something about the way of life that seems like it's a really good framing around what life can be. But I've also not lived there for a long period of time, so maybe it's different.
Did you ever live in France?
I mean, not really. I was there for maybe 6 weeks. So, okay. I mean, I guess that's kind of living there. I was there and I was living.
Okay, how about this? What's your favorite vacation destination?
You know, I don't know if I have a favorite. I think my favorite vacation, if I think back, when I was growing up, we once went up to Maine to places like Bar Harbor and then up to Montreal, and I just remember that as being really special at the time. So that's what's coming to mind right now.
Okay, all right. How about this question? Here we go. As you've studied for the Monk Manual to put it together, what was the one thing about Monk's life you're like, I don't want to put that in there?
Well, you know what? It's actually something I would have wanted to put in there, but I didn't put it in there because I didn't feel like I was ready. But so the Monk Manual, it is a productivity system, quote unquote. I think the way that we approach productivity is a little bit different. But as a system, it doesn't really address the whole communal aspect that you find in monasticism, which I think is extremely important. But I didn't feel like I understood enough of how to transform the form of community. I didn't know if I knew exactly how to go and kind of take monastic community and try to turn it into something kind of that could rhyme in the world. So maybe that's the piece, but it wasn't because I didn't want it. It's just I didn't feel like it was appropriate at the time.
Ooh, we can get to that one in a minute, but we need to get the last question of the Fast Five. If you could pick one movie to represent your life, what would it be and why?
Tree of Life by Terrence Malick.
Oh, interesting. I've not seen that.
It's quite good. Some people actually hate it. Hate it. It's one of those movies that's very, very polarizing. I think like 50% of people walk out. The people who don't walk out usually are like, that's my favorite thing I've ever seen. Very, I think just watch a trailer. I think you'll be interested.
Okay. All right. I might check that out. I've heard someone mention Terrence Malick before. I've not actually seen any of his films, so at least that I know of. Maybe I have. I don't know. All right, but let's talk about the Monk Manual. Your bio mentions that you spent a decade pushing yourself to the limit in every which way and it wasn't working. So what then inspired you to turn to monks to talk about productivity?
Yeah, one of the things that we're going to find in our conversation is I'm naturally a bit long-winded. So I'm going to try
you're on the perfect show. You're on the perfect show.
I'm going to really try and compress it down. The thing is, I had been really interested in productivity and had essentially been leaning into that as a model for reaching my own personal potential. Or it was more than that because some of it's also tied up in probably certain fears and control and self-worth, all of these things, as it is for many people. I was really inspired at the time. I've always been really interested in psychology. I've been interested in philosophy, psychology for a long time. It's just like the bigger questions. That's just part of what interests me. And I came across the ideas of Martin Seligman, who's the head of the American Psychological Association for a while. And he has this thing called positive psychology. There's this model in that called PERMA that lays out what he calls like a scientific theory or scientific model for happiness, human happiness and flourishing. And when I was encountering that, I thought to myself, oh, it's so interesting because it seems like actually monks, like their whole system of life is ordered towards producing these things. So that was one thing. I also, it's one of those things where when you encounter people who seem to be living differently, or are flourishing on a certain level, maybe it's just like there's a certain joy in their eyes, or there's a certain way of being that they have, right? That's kind of more of an esoteric way to put it, but this like way of being, there's something that can strike you, especially if you're looking for pathways forward. And I just been around a few different monks that I was just really attracted to, and I saw, I don't know, I guess I was able to see how their way of life, I think, contributed to that. So. Yeah.
You said that you were around. I mean, very few people are around monks. How did you get around monks to begin with?
Well, I mean, it wasn't. I went on a few retreats. I mean, that was like the long and short of it. But I started going on some silent retreats. Probably, I don't know. I think I started first going maybe 10 years ago, 15 years. I actually don't know. I'm really bad with timelines, which is funny because a lot of this isn't all the time. But just remembering dates. I still to this day, if someone asks me when did I graduate high school, I don't know. I mean, my wife has to remind me my age. I'm just really bad at that stuff. I'm not even saying that it's a joke. Like that's actually true.
I believe you. I have a lot of guys on the show that are a little bit like that. So
yeah. That's the thing. So. Just silent retreats, going to some different monasteries, being around people, and then you also have people that you don't know directly, but you encounter through their works, right? Like people like Thomas Merton. Actually, when I was in college, I got introduced to a class on. It wasn't a class, but it was a group on Thomas Merton. That's how I first got introduced to Thomas Merton. If you're familiar, I imagine you are. So yeah, I'm just really. I think something piqued my interest, and I just saw a lot of things overlapping. Yeah.
Well, let's get into this. Okay, so for those that don't know, let's talk about what actually is the monk manual. I have one here. I've been going through it for some time. I was curious about it because I'm naturally anti systems just
Sure.
as a person.
Yeah.
Although I have been following your stuff on LinkedIn, so there's been some even comments that you've made that I'm like, well, that's good. I need to remember that. We all need structure. God has created us to need structure, and this is helping you with structure, just with the overwhelming crush of modernity. So tell us what then Monk Manual actually is. I mean, it's a productivity system we know, but what else?
The thing is the closest thing. So there's Monk Manual, which is the overarching organization, and that's actually a number of different things, right? There's different tools, resources. There's some courses. The primary though tool that people use, and what started Monk Manual, was a 90-day planner. We now have a weekly planner as well. We call it a planner because it's one of those things that if we called it something else, it wouldn't really make sense, right? You have to have some category that you can connect in with. How it's different from planners, as people might be familiar with them, is there's a really big emphasis on intentionality. So it's not so much like, hey, just lay out maybe the dates, write down your to-do list for the day. The idea is it's trying to present a system that helps you be intentional with your time and actively choose and engage. So not to be passive necessarily, but to really engage and be intentional about what are you going to say yes to, what are you going to say no to? Because the thing is we're finite beings with seemingly infinite demands, and so if we don't choose, other forces are going to choose for us. At the same time, I want to say, like, I am a big believer that it's good to stay open to particular movements and to be able to have the space to be able to react to things that come up. But my own belief is that when you bring a certain amount of order in and you do that active choosing, it actually creates the space for you to be able to respond more powerfully when those opportunities come. So on one hand, it's that. It's also a bundle of some various practices, gratitude practices, some things that, if people are familiar with the Examine, rhyme quite closely with the Examine, but I wanted to try and integrate some of those practices into kind of like a living Examine, as I like to think of it. So rather than having kind of this disintegrated, well, you have this spiritual practice over here and you have this like work practice over here. In my mind, part of the actual one of the things that inspired my imagination around monks was that they lived this very integrated life that was like active and spiritual all the time. They don't have this illusion of, hey, I got my active life and I got my spiritual life, but it's all happening all at once, and it happens to be active and spiritual fully in both directions. So there's other practices in prompts that are included. And the idea was I was trying to take certain elements of what living as a monk is like, some of the aspects of their way of life that maybe we can't mirror in terms of form, because most people, when they think of a monk, they think of, all right, that person's wearing this robe, or they're spending this time in meditation, or they're living in community. There's so many things that feel inaccessible to us because of the form it manifests as. But I was interested in what is the function behind that form? Like, what were they actually, what is the purpose behind it? Because there's probably ways we can achieve similar purposes in our own life. So I've tried to bundle those things together. And then the other thing that you'll notice in the monk manuals, there's a pretty heavy element of reflection. I would actually say that's probably one of the main differentiators from a lot of other systems. It's also one of the main value adds, I guess. I think it's a really, really important part of the tool, because my own belief is that our own path as human beings, anytime we're iterating ourselves, what happens is, like, someone listens to this show, right? Maybe they take a new idea, it's a new data point, and they think, oh, I'm going to maybe approach this a little bit differently. That's what happens for us all the time. As we grow, that's all that's happening. So through reflection, we can pay attention more to the data points from our own life. When did we feel unrest? When were we at our best? And we can actually accelerate that virtuous cycle of growth that happens, and make sure that we're staying aligned in the process. Because for me, one of the greatest tragedies is when people move really fast and they focus with all their energy in a direction, only to realize, like, 20 years later, like, oh, I really chose the wrong path. And I'm not saying vocationally, but I think what's more common is you have people who are like, I don't know, maybe it's a business leader, for example. I know a lot of the people listening are more in a ministry setting, but it's not that uncommon to have someone who's a business leader who goes all in their business to realize, like, oh, I actually wasn't there with my family at all. And And that's difficult, right? And it's
Mhm.
not necessary, is what I'm trying to get at. Like I think that those data points in our heart are always there, and if we can stay with that, or in the movements that are taking place, that just really serves us well, and we can kind of participate in the process of life that's already taking place.
I think that's very interesting that you mentioned that. I'm reminded of David Brooks. And
Hmm.
David Brooks had written that there is those virtues, he calls those resume virtues and the obituary virtues.
Mm.
And we find in his one of his books, I think it was The Second Mountain, he mentions that most people spend the first part of their life going up the first mountain to find out that it's not what they really wanted, and then they spent the second half of their life going through that second mountain, which is much more where the virtue lies, and
Hmm.
that's where those obituary virtues, which you find themselves.
Hmm.
You were talking about just being in business and being so driven. What were you doing before you launched the Monk Manual?
Yeah, so I was actually working for a fairly large national nonprofit. Um, I was doing business consulting at the time too, but I was running a relatively large team at a large nonprofit. But the thing was is within when you're in a situation like that, it's not that far off from any other business setting. And part of it was like the actual tenor of which I approached my life was just extremely fast paced. Like I remember going from like one meeting to the next with a coffee in my hand, literally running from like a meeting to a meeting. Not because I had to, but that was like the speed of it. It was like I was on Wall Street all the time or something. Like that was I was very, very much focused on efficiency and getting all the things done. So
How do you gauge the efficiency in these virtues that we see in the culture itself, productivity, virtue, and how do you contrast that with simply being? Because those seem to be almost mutually contradictory to one another or mutually exclusive to one another. But
mhm,
yet you're saying that monks integrated them. How do
mhm,
we make sure that we don't cater everything to what we produce and that take that time to simply be?
mhm, mhm. That's that's a simple question, but it's actually a really big question. And I'll try to answer it briefly, but it gets to the core of some of the ideas behind the monk manual. So um, to understand kind of the situation we're in around productivity, I think it can be helpful to actually look at when did productivity become popular, right? So when you actually look at the growth of the word productive, uh, when it became popularized, there's this meteoric rise between about 1760 to 1820, which is the Industrial Revolution, right? And when I was taught the Industrial Revolution in school, usually it's presented as a time of technological innovation. It's like, oh, look at all these cool ways that we're able to produce more, get all these things done. But what's more subtle that's actually going on there is a shift of value, where value actually becomes more centered around production for production's sake. And these are all systems, right? So humans become a part of that system, and in a
Mhm.
literal sense, in that form, right, where you're working in a factory,
Yeah.
it's focused on production. You're a part of that larger machine, in a sense, right? There's less people, I think, statistically now who are working in those sorts of settings here in at least the United States, where I am. Uh, but that's a part of kind of like the soul of how we experience life, right? And there's people will talk about, like, if you meet someone on the street and you're like, how have you been? It's not uncommon if it's someone you know for them to say like, oh, I've been so busy, right? And
Yeah.
that's almost like a cliche at this point, but it's also the sort of thing where busy is a badge of honor. And I highlight that not so much to speak to something that I think people already do, which is like, that's actually somewhat problematic. I think most of us, when we step back, we think like, oh, we actually don't want to be that busy, but we don't see how uh, kind of how deeply seated this production for production's sake mentality is within us. I would even argue that, and this is something that I don't think is often talked about, but it's even in the way people do ministry, and it's very much so even in the way a lot of times people's own spiritual lives manifest, right? Like the it's just so hard to free ourselves from that mentality. So when I think of being, um, I don't actually think of being as being opposed per se to doing. Because when I talk about being, I don't think about it as, okay, well, being time is when you're going and you're meditating or you're praying or you're surfing on a beach. It's actually a qualitative term. It has to do with the degree to which you're actually engaging the present moment as it is, the degree to which you're actually engaging reality. And I would argue God, as God is in reality, revealing aspects of himself through reality. So it actually has to do more with one's engagement. There's a question I'll sometimes ask people of, like, if you were to think of your mental space, like just where your mind spends its energy, what percentage of time do you spend in the past versus the present versus the future? You tend to find a lot of leaders will find that they spend maybe 80% of their time just in the future, right? You find, and that's not specific to leaders, but a lot of times, because I work with entrepreneurs, and that's almost always the case. And that might be kind of archetypically entrepreneurs as well. They're more, they just naturally go there. There's other people who spend a lot of their energy in the past. I think the idea is finding, really operating from that place of center in the present moment, in responding, but also fully engaging. So in a sense, the argument I'd make is that in order to fully do, like to actually achieve full being and full doing, they actually have to work together, right? Like if you're actually fully being, then you're actually able to fully do, because you're really enmeshed and engaged in whatever's in front of you. There's a certain height of creative potential that you're realizing in the moment, that otherwise you wouldn't, because I mean, a lot of times, for example, like someone might be there, but they're not really there. They're everywhere except where they are. So are they really doing something, or are they just doing things in their head in some sort of imaginary world?
So let me ask you a question. Obviously, I mean, this is a subject you care you are passionate about. You've thought this through. I mean, that's an understatement. How do you, though, simply, I mean, even as I was talking to you, your schedule is packed. You're from one thing to the next to the next. And I remember years ago hearing someone say they'd read Henri Nouwen, and they said, I went to go visit him because I often want to know, do the authors live according to what they write? Is that something that you find with yourself? I mean, when you get done at the end of the day, can you just simply turn it off?
Okay, that's a great question. And it's a great, honest question. I think that we need to ask questions like this way more, right? Because I think a lot of times it's so easy to talk it. It's a much harder to walk it. I'll answer it from a couple different directions. One thing I'll say is the reason I feel like I can speak confidently about it, but also why I'm passionate about it, is because it's deeply, deeply personal for me. It's actually a place that I'm naturally not good at. I'll take that back. I don't know if I'm naturally not good at it, but at one point I woke up and I realized I'm not good at this. Maybe as a kid I was good at it, but I've definitely been more on the side of entirely in the future, entirely not present, entirely. And so in some ways, I'm about as far as you can go in understanding what that's like and feeling out the contours of that and feeling out the difficulties that come with that. I want to say there's an authority maybe that comes from that, because it's not theory. That, like, none of this is stuff that I've just went on Google and I'm like, and then I'm just regurgitating it back. Like, this is lived. At the same time, I will say that I'm still on that journey. And if you were to talk to my wife, like if right now I called up my wife and brought her in, she would probably say, yeah, I'm still on that journey, but I'm also a completely different person than I used to be. And my experience of life is completely different, to the degree of, I don't even know how to describe it. Yeah, my experience of life is just totally different, because the way I'm engaging the world is totally different. I'll also speak to briefly, and this is part of it has to do with my own role and in the way I'm able to configure my role. But what you experience, like my schedule being very full, part of what I've tried to do for myself, I was inspired by monks, and the idea that with monks, they actually have a schedule where they know at any given time exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And to me, I was inspired because I thought, man, there's such a freedom to that, to know, okay, from 9 to 10, I'm in prayer. There's nowhere else, because they've taken commitments, and they really believe that this is what God's called them to. So it's like, look, I know that if I'm being obedient to this rule, and I don't need to think about this or that. Like, I know right now this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. So what I've tried to do is get really good at saying yes and no to things, and try to make carve out time and almost operate off of a schedule in that way where I'm able to just fully be there, right? And there is quite a bit that's back to back, but because I know it's actually been designed in a certain sense and it's intentional, just like the system of monks living into, I can be very present in the moment because I'm not actually so busy. I don't believe busy is actually a term that describes someone's external life so much as their internal one. It's more of an experience of life. It's more of a feeling that I feel busy. I feel like I'm all over the place. I feel this kind of like chaos of my mind's going, oh, there and there and this thing. And oh, I got to remember to do that and this and that. So externally, if you look at like my schedule, I'm a busy person, but I don't actually feel busy in that in the same way. And it's not just because I'm using the tool. I mean, there's so much I've had to grow in, even just surrendering control in certain ways and being open. And again, I don't want to go and I don't want to make it sound like I'm at the top of like a mountain, but I mean, I can truthfully say like I've come a really long way.
That's something that I've always wondered about as we're trying to navigate the productivity tools. Because my wife is always talking about productivity. She's tried all these different kinds of systems, and every year there's another system that she's talking about. And so when after I met you, and I thought, well, I want to try this. I like the idea of a monk manual, just because I do know that monks have their time separated. And I was reminded of actually the Christian financial guru Dave Ramsey, who said every dollar has to have an assignment. And I kind of take that principle to time. Every minute is assigned. If I know it's assigned, then I know where it's going. I don't have to worry about it. I don't feel like I waste it. And it's interesting how we've even appropriated financial terms to time. Waste, invest, spend. It's just fascinating how we've changed all that. But rarely, or not, I don't want to say rarely, I think people have come to the end of themselves where they've like, well, I've done everything I can to produce, but I feel wasted in my soul in the middle of all this, because modernity crushes us on. You've talked about the Industrial Revolution. We've talked about that a lot on here, as well as the Enlightenment. We've talked about how we've got into the modern situation in which we find ourselves. We think that balance is probably impossible. We've had other terms that have been used like rhythm. Can you find your rhythm in life? That's much more where it is, because we know so many people that are just crushed under anxiety and producing. And how do you help people to pause, or how does the tool help people to pause and reflect over these things in life that they're dealing with?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm glad you actually brought up the connection with money, because a lot of times when people end up using a budget for the first time, at first it's kind of painful because they maybe are facing something and they realize like, oh, that's not how I thought it was. Or maybe it's like, oh man, we actually don't have the money to be living the way we're living. Like we have to say no to certain things or this or that. It makes something concrete that otherwise felt abstract. Now, money by nature is actually more concrete than time is. Time, we all know time is finite, but it never feels finite. It feels finite insofar as we never feel like we get our list done. But it feels like this thing that it's actually more like you wake up every single day and you get a check for $1,000 and it gets spent no matter what at the end of the day. But you're going to get another check the next day. You can't go and save it. You can't go and invest it somewhere and get more time on the back end. Maybe you can theoretically by like living healthy or something. But I think that's also, you don't have control over that, right? It's a little bit hard to wrap one's head around because it's not, I don't think it's obvious, but in a sense, I think one of the reasons that we're always feeling overburdened is because we're constantly living in a sense of like time indebtedness. This feeling that we're always behind, like there's always more we should be doing, like we're always a bit over budget, but we don't really understand it. So one of the things is if you can actually go in upfront, like if you can look at your day and say, look, here's the 3 things that I'm going to commit to with my time. What you're doing is you're actually putting limits on what's actually possible, and you're connecting reality. You're connecting your time to something concrete. And then it's just a question of whether you want to follow through on that or not. But you also get that added benefit on the back end of not having to feel necessarily bad of like, oh, I just don't know like what I did with my time, or I feel like I'm always in debt. Like it actually in some ways makes you confront the reality that you are just finite. And I think that's really that's one of the critical steps. I had something I'll do with clients is like a time audit, and people who are listening, I recommend doing this sort of thing, where for a week, just track how you spend your time. Hour by hour, every hour, just write down. In the more detailed, the better. Don't just write email for 3 hours. Write down like, what were you doing, right? And where did you go? A lot of times people spend time on things they don't think they do. Part of that is when we're not actually paying attention, we tend to get carried away and time passes faster, right? So I sometimes get sucked into Wikipedia, just researching a random thing. 3 hours can go by without me really realizing it, right? And that tends to happen when we get sucked in, whether it's TV or whatever it might be, YouTube. I don't know what people, who's listening will be able to kind of self-select what that is for them. But the other part of it is sometimes you end up, one of the real gifts of it, I once had a woman go through it with me who was a mother and had a number of kids. And what was actually really helpful for her is she realized like, look, actually, I'd always been really I'd been feeling bad about not being able to move these things forward and how I wasn't getting all this stuff done. But what I realized is I spent a lot of time being a mom, and actually being a mom takes a lot of time. And actually that is my priority. And so it gave her this kind of blessing of realizing like, I'm actually spending my time the way that I want to be spending it, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not my place to go and say, hey, this is how someone should be spending their time. I think if someone's coming from a Christian prerogative, it's more of a grappling of like, how am I spending my time in a way that is really honoring what God's intentions are for me in my life. And so I thought that was going to connect in with what your question was, but I think I went off a little bit. So maybe you can take that and intertwine it back.
No, I think what you're mentioning is something that I think our people have been feeling for some time. And allow me to explain. We had a pastor friend. I had a conversation with him, and he said, we're getting ready to do an outreach. And so I put these cards together at my church and passed them out to everybody. And I got one response out of 200 cards that I sent out to do this new ministry we wanted to do. He goes, so I was quite dejected. Monday, I was really down in the dumps, as many pastors are. And his wife came to him and said, I don't understand why you're so down. I don't know what you thought you were going to get. People are already so busy. You're asking them to do another thing. And he came to me and he said, I need to understand, how do you reach people that are so busy? And I said, I think the question is actually wrong. I think the question is why are we so busy to begin with? What is it that we intuitively believe that we need to accomplish and do and have to do all these things? We feel this pressure that we only live once, we can do and be everything we want to be. But I think we're learning now we have limits, as you've already mentioned. And we had a theologian on that I mentioned in the introduction. His name is Kelly Kapic. And he said, he wrote a book called You're Only Human. Meaning that you can't go beyond the limits of time itself. You can't be everywhere. You can't do everything, even though the internet has given us that ability to be. And you're in Buffalo and I'm in Florida right now. So we're having this conversation, and I've had conversations this past week in the Philippines and in Australia. We have this feeling we can be everywhere and do everything, but we can't. So to realize that time is actually a gift, that it actually helps remind us that we are only human. We can only produce. Now we are called to produce. But one of the things that we've noted on the show is that God has created culture and with a structure and direction, and it's a movement towards something. But when we go beyond of what that intended it to be, then that's when we get into dehumanization, and that actually we begin to wilt. God has called us to flourish. We want to flourish. I mean, even the cultural mandate in Genesis chapter 1 says that they were to steward or Genesis chapter 2, to steward the garden, to work. God created us to work, created us to produce. But as you mentioned, and I think it's very true, that it changed in the Industrial Revolution, where it became more about your production. And then, of course, the economy and money drives it. Time is money. But it's the pushback to say, no, I'm still a human and I can only do so much within that time God allotted to me. Now, I do want to be the best in the steward of what God has given me. And we need that structure. That's what I do like about the Monk Manual. It gives you that structure. It pushes you through and allows you to free yourself from the constraints of every other voice that's calling at you, and gives you kind of, it quiets those different pieces by only allowing you to hear a few voices to move forward.
Mhm.
And is that kind of, I mean, again, I know you threw it back to me and I'm throwing it back to you. Is that kind of the thing that you're seeing through this? And even the people that are talking to you that are entrepreneurs, is that the cry that they have? They feel like they have to be and do everything?
It does come down to some fundamental models for the human person, and even what production looks like. So that word productive originally actually comes out of agriculture. If you think of produce, right? It's the same root. And I think that model for like an agricultural model, one of like bearing fruit, of like cultivating a plant, organic matter, that actually is much more aligned with, I think, how our potential can actually manifest. And if we approach things like we're assembly line, not only do we treat ourselves like a machine, but we also can tend to treat other people like commodities. And I don't think that, I just think it sets up, it's operating under a number of false pretenses, right? Now, I say that with some irony, because in many ways, I've approached things with the Monk Manual from taking a bit of like a more of a mass market approach. What I mean by that is, it's not like I got together with the 10 closest people I knew and I said like, hey, let's build a relationship and do this and that. One of the most difficult things is to let go of some of those narratives and those compulsions and realize that really all we need to do is, yes, be intentional, but it's really about like cultivating the plant that is us and trying to make that, don't even want to say make that flourish. I want to say allow that to flourish, because we're not even the gardener. Like what I mean by that is like we're co-creating, but we're not we're not the driver. And oftentimes it feels like we're the driver, but we're really not, right? And so it's more of that cooperation and not turning away. And it's always a delicate balance between how much do you push and how much do you allow. And I think at its best, it's a dance where you're receiving and you're giving and you're trying to move with it, but understanding that there is a process bigger than you. And I'll just share like one other piece, and this goes back to that finitude piece. You know, I remember I was with a friend who is a director, and he had made a documentary, and part of what they did was they worked with they went to an orphanage with children, I believe, who had AIDS in Africa. And I'm sitting with them and having a beer, and I'm like, how do you go and have a beer? This costs like $8 or something or whatever it is. Like, how do you do that when you know that this is what's taking place over there? And he's like, yeah, that's a hard thing to resolve. He's like, honestly, I try not to think about it all that much. But he shared with me the story of the nonprofit that he had gone and done this documentary with. He shared a story. He shared what that founder had shared with him, which was like, look, I'm not God. Like, I can feed a few kids, but I'm not God. Like, that's God's work to go and, you know, and I think that's also like a part of it, is realizing like we're not God. And part of it, honestly, you know, what's funny is when I think back to the whole productivity thing, a lot of that was my own compulsion to try and pretend I was God. Like, and I think culturally that it's all integrated, right? Like there's a cultural move where, of course, it's going to be the case when, I mean, God is still a part of the conversation in our culture, but in anchoring to God as like a transcendent force that's in control, I think every year that passes, that's seeping out a little bit more. And of course, we're going to feel like we need to control more, or of course, we're going to want government to control more, whatever it might be, because it's terrifying otherwise. Because no one wants to surrender to an ocean that's going to swallow them up, right? Like, no one wants to be. It can be terrifying, right? And so that's a part of it too. Is it? And that's the beauty of it. Is I think a lot of the growth, to me, I think the growth, it's like a twofold growth. I think the doing growth, it does come down to intentionality. Part of it is it's like, okay, you get one response back. There might also be a thing of like, okay, well, maybe there's a different way of approaching this, or maybe this isn't the right thing for this community. And I do think that's our responsibility to think critically and say like, what works, what doesn't work, what's working for these people. We can do that. We have that capacity. We have that gift to be able to go and look and imagine, and that's great, and it can be exciting. The other path, so that's the doing path, which I think is intentionality. I think the being path is actually trust. I think it's a growth of trust, because you can't really surrender to like the present moment unless you trust.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think, I'm getting excited here. I think, I really do believe, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I really do believe that if you're dedicated and you say like, hey, just every day I'm going to try and become more intentional and also more trusting or more surrendered, I kind of feel like those are the two wheels of the bike. You know what I mean? Like at that
Yeah.
point, I don't know what's really missing. And there's a lot under those umbrellas. There's practices, there's ways of living, there's ways of treating others. But it seems like those are the two core movements that open us up to what actually could be.
You
What
mean
do you think about that?
the trusting and what? Give me the two
And
parts again.
intentionality and trust. I actually,
Yeah.
I would love for you to disagree with me. I'm throwing this out, and I
Well,
want to hear your thoughts.
I think, I mean, we're limited on time, but intentionality is huge. I do think intentionality is great, but I don't really think intentionality is always everything. But the trust part, I think, is massive. And I
Mhm.
think that is where the imagination kicks in because when fear hits, the imagination explodes on all the things that it could happen or does happen. And then the more choices you have, the more exponential your fear becomes. That's why even your stress level, like you go to the grocery store, and I make this joke all the time, and your wife says, go get some cereal, and there's 500 cereals. Your stress level is high because you don't know which one to get. But when you have three choices, well, suddenly your stress level goes down. So in our culture today, I think it is hard for people to trust because we are told to produce, to achieve, we can do whatever our heart desires. And it's like no limits. And we have all these things put in front of us all the time of these people that are successful. And so you feel that internal pressure to announce yourself to the world, to produce in this way. But I find that people are actually doing the opposite. And I think trust is the hardest thing you can do. I think it was hard for the nation of Israel in the Old Testament when they had to observe the Sabbath day. We're not going to work. We're going to cease. We're going to let every other nation is going to do this thing where they have their sacred space. We're going to have our sacred space with time where we're going to stop producing. And even then, you see it with them because on the sixth day, it says that they were every day they come, they would only gather enough manna for that day. Except the sixth day, they were to get twice as much, even though they got in trouble for doing twice as much before. And it would turn to have like worms in it, maggots, and all this stuff. So then this other day, he's like, okay, I wanted you to come and just get enough for every day. But this day, I want you to get this too. You can get double. And then you can't come back the next day. Well, of course, people come back the next day because they can't trust. I think we always have a trust problem. I have a trust issue. I mean, I talk about this all the time because we know of the failures. We know of what does that mean to trust? How do I trust? And that's why the scripture says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will direct your paths. But what does that mean? And in a daily way. This is why it's our daily bread. So I think there is an intentionality to it. But I think what God also does in the scripture, and I remember C.S. Lewis and Mother Teresa both saying this, and they both said that when you first become a Christian, God, it seems like all those really miraculous answers to prayer come right before you're a believer or come right after. But as time goes on, God, it seems like he is taking the training wheels off, and you have to trust in a different way then.
Mhm.
And it goes to the deep parts of who you are, where you start finding out, and you said yourself, you start finding out what your own idols are, your own, my control issues, my trauma. Why do I feel the need to control? Why do I feel the need to do this? Why do I have such a hard time being quiet? I remember another time where I have a friend, I remember reading this as a pastor, where a man, he had a counseling practice in his church. And rather than meeting with a couple right away, he had them sit for 20 or 30 minutes in the sanctuary before they would come and meet him. And he said 8 times out of 10, they had their issue taken care of. They didn't know how to be quiet and be still to be able to listen. And I think we need to do that. That's why I like the monk manual. But productivity, we are still to produce. We do need that structure. Culture is always moving. God has called us to work. But the question is when does it become the point in time where we've gone beyond the limits which God intended it to be, and that it actually becomes a form of idolatry of that production? And so those are the things that I had, but I didn't have this conversation to hear me talk. It was to hear you talk
Mhm.
on this. But this is a fascinating conversation, but I do know that you have another appointment after this, so you have a hard stop. Um, we didn't even get to, actually, last question before I get to the water bottle for today. We talked about the role of community. You mentioned that was the one part that you missed when you were putting this together. What is that part? What role does community play in the transformation of productivity, but also in being? and this integration that you're talking about, what role does community play in that? Do you feel comfortable with that now? You said you weren't comfortable with it before, but do you now?
I'm comfortable enough to discuss it in what I'm thinking right now. I don't know if I've mapped everything out. So when I first was building the monk manual, I didn't think that I had. It's almost like I didn't understand the function of community enough and how all the different elements worked within a monastic setting to be able to say, oh, this is how you port that over. I did try to gesture towards it by just having a prompt of how can I give today something along those lines is in the monk manual on a daily basis, because I do think there's a danger when we're thinking about productivity or even planning that it kind of becomes something where we look in versus out. So trying to anchor it in that. I am right now, I'm actually like, if you were to ask what is the question I'm living through right now, it is this question of how do you go and take maybe a community ideal and port it over, whether that's to families, whether that's to more of like a community group. I feel like that's part of my own journey right now to try and understand that. I do know some elements, right? Like one of the things that makes a monastic community work is the fact that people are, at least in abstraction, but also in reality, oriented towards the same values, right? Mm-hmm. On the highest level, they're oriented towards the same values. There's also something magical, I think, that happens because there is commitment, right? A lot of times in communities nowadays, there's not really a real sense of true commitment to either something bigger than themselves or to the group itself. So I think being with other people in that way, in a committed fashion, does something. But the reason I'm trying to really grapple with this and understand it is because I mean we hopped on before we got on our call today, we were talking about AI, right? And this isn't about AI per se, but I think that community is one of the most, I don't know, maybe like this is dramatic to say, but like bankrupt aspects of society. Like community is a real pain point for virtually everyone. Because I know a lot of people who are faithful Christians, but also not. And it's like across the board, right? People are feeling isolated. Across the board, people are feeling commoditized or whatever it is. I even think that part of the real thrust of kind of like I need to express myself is actually just this desperate desire for someone to actually see you. Right? For someone to actually not feel like a cog in some sort of marketing machine or whatever it is. So community feels like it's actually a societal problem, that potentially one of the greatest ones that we're facing. I think that when you look at monasticism, it's traditionally a giant source of innovation, education, healthcare, all these things that over time, I think the secular world has largely caught up to. I think that no one really has a great answer for the community piece. So I'm intrigued about it on that level. I'm also intrigued by it because I think with AI and changes that are going to happen, I think community is going to be more important. I'm not saying that in like an apocalyptic sense or anything like that, but I'm saying more so from a standpoint of it's like the more that our lives are driven by that which isn't human, I think the more we'll desire that which is human. And also, I personally really want to understand that. Like, I personally want to understand. So one of the premises behind productivity is that meaning comes from what you do. It's your action. Community mandates that it's also what you receive, and it's also what you're a part of. And that's something that's been opening up more for me. It naturally, because it has to, as I've been growing, it kind of has to move beyond me to something else. And so that's part of my own just general interest. So I don't actually have an answer to what it is. I'm actually certain that you have a better answer than I do.
Well, I think your answer is actually pretty good. I think you've hit the nail on the head. That's what we've noticed, is that people are feeling much more isolated than they've ever have before. That's why one of the things that we're most passionate about is kind of a relational revolution within the churches itself, because the churches have become more of an attract and see type of idea, operating in a cultural topography that has shifted. And we're saying the culture has shifted now where belonging is so much more important for people. And even our brains are hardwired that way. We've talked a lot about neurotheology on this show. We are actually wired to belong to a group of people and to feel like we're a part of it. And you're right, people are feeling much more isolated than they ever have. I love what you said, though, about this productivity, where I'm announcing it to the world that I'm more than just a cog in the machine, that I'm actually a part of it, that I can know and be known in the full expression of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I think relationally we're missing that. But I also think in the way that I understand church and how I've experienced it, it's there. And I think it's one of the natural places that we have. I think in society, I think we try to manifest it and try to find it in a lot of different ways. We try to create what should be within the church. Now, I think it's largely, I think the church is operating off of a model that is much more business related, and they're getting business results. And it's not for the flourishing of humanity. It's for a very narrow individualistic understanding of what it means for salvation. But I think that they need to understand more broad, because it's not only when Jesus said that they might have life, they have a life to the full. And yes, it's talking about eternity, but there's the idea of living a better life even now to the world around me, that I'm transformed and that I have something to offer the world, and the world has something, and I mean the world, but the people around me, and that they have something to offer me as well. And I love how you said that it's opening up. And I think everyone's feeling that. And you said Christian and non-Christian. I think that's very true. And we've had a lot of conversations on this show because there's a thing right now called the Great Dechurching that's going on. 40 million people have stopped going to church in the last 25 years in the United States of America. The question is why? What is it? What's happened? And there's a lot of reasons why in the surveys and the data, and they actually think that the number's a lot bigger than 40 million. But one of the things is people feel like they move to a new city and they don't belong anymore. They don't know how to form relationships. And as our life continually becomes more online, it becomes more difficult to do, because now people are talking past one another. AI and technology is isolating it, where we're only hearing the algorithm, the voices of the algorithm is giving us, depending on what our media diet is, and then we become further isolated. So it becomes more imperative. I think you've actually hit it really well. Is we need to be meeting in person more fully. I think the church provides that personally. I just think people need to recover in what that looks like. But I know you do have a limited time today. One final thought here. What's a final water bottle that we can give the people that are listening to our conversation? Something, a truth for them to sip on in this coming week for them.
There's a plaque that supposedly Carl Jung, the psychologist, had over his door that said, in Latin, it said, "Invoked or not, God is present." And I really love the idea of, people are familiar with like Lectio Divina, of like studying scripture and kind of praying through it. I really love the idea of almost trying to look at one's life as like a living Lectio and say, like, what is God doing here in my life today? Because I think God is always doing something. So that'd be my water bottle.
I like that. How can people get a hold of the Monk Manual and learn more about your organization or some of the tools that you have to offer?
Yeah, sure. So you can go to monkmanual.com. That's where we have all of our various products. We're also on Instagram at Monk Manual. You can also find me, Stephen Lawson, with a V, on LinkedIn if you want to connect there. But yeah, I'm around, and I plan on working on this for quite some time. So hopefully you'll pop over.
That'd be awesome. Stephen, thank you for coming on Apollos Watered.
Thank you, Travis. This has been great.